Speaking is fluid and spontaneous. It's the effortless expression of meaning. It's not the result of rehearsing lines, calculated grammar, or word-for-word translations from your native language. It's the kind of natural, automatic speech that me and you do every day in our own native languages, where we're not consciously constructing sentences in our heads before we say them. We just almost think and speak at the same time. It's just natural, just flows out of you. But that kind of natural automatic speech is only possible because we have a deep internal understanding of our own native languages. When we try to learn other languages and we try to speak early on, we don't have that. So a lot of the time, we don't end up speaking, we end up parroting. Parrots can mimic the sounds of human speech, but that doesn't mean they actually understand what they're saying. And when we're pushed early on in new languages to speak the language, we end up being more like a parrot than like me or you speaking in our own native languages. It's imitation without comprehension. I'm not saying parroting is all bad. Sometimes you do need to have stock sentences if you're actually living in the country of the language you're trying to learn, or you're traveling abroad and you need some survival phrases to, find your hotel or find a bathroom. Then it totally makes sense to just kind of see a sentence in the language that you want to be able to say, practice it, and be able to say it so you can actually ask people how to do certain things. What I am saying is that's short-term utility. It's not actually acquiring the language. It doesn't build that internal system required for that natural automatic speech that we use when we speak our native languages. When you hear and understand the language, that's input. That's what builds that internal system. That's language acquisition. But when you're speaking, that's output. Output can only draw on that internal system. When you try to speak before you've had enough input, you end up trying to draw from a pattern bank that just doesn't exist yet, which is why speech early on can feel so limited and forced, and divorced, again, from the way we actually naturally speak in our own languages. To put it poetically, it's like if you're trying to paint a painting, but you have an empty palette, you don't have any colors. You're trying to express yourself, but you don't have the means to do so yet. And speaking too early doesn't just feel unnatural, it can actually hurt you in the long run. Because when you speak from an early stage, you tend to just kind of try to reach for what works because you're not really sure, which might mean directly translating phrases from your native language to your target language that don't really make sense in your target language. Or it might mean trying to consciously apply grammar rules to your sentences that end up with, again, unnatural phrasing that natives just don't fully understand or don't speak like. And the issue with that is it opens you up to errors. And if you start repeating errors too often, they can start to feel normal. And that's when fossilization happens. Fossilization is when the mistakes we make speaking a language become automatic. We repeat them so many times that we don't even realize we're doing them, even though we might have more input and we might be able to kind of consciously hear that they're wrong. We don't even think about it because we've repeated them so many times. And these types of fossilized artifacts can be very hard to unlearn. So another way to put that is that speaking early doesn't just not build the system, it can actually end up building the wrong system. And the same thing can happen with pronunciation, because when you're new to a language, sounds from your target language, they might sound similar to sounds from your native language, and it might be hard to distinguish them even though they are different. So when you don't have enough input, you can end up approximating sounds that sound right to you, but they're actually a bit off from what the real sounds are from your target language. Some examples from Spanish would be like, in Spanish, you don't push out air when you say T, so the T can feel a bit more strong in English, where the T in Spanish can sound a bit weaker. So, for instance, like if I said to do in Spanish, in English, and if I say todo in Spanish, you hear the difference, to do, todo. I'm not expulsing air. And that might be really hard for you to pick up on if you're just getting into learning Spanish. But after hundreds of hours of input, you begin to hear it better and better and better. But what can block your progress is if you early on start trying to say the word, because then you start mixing up the actual sound of the word with your own approximation. And this is doubly true with languages that are further removed from English, like Chinese, where there's tones. It's going to be really hard for you to pick up on them in the beginning. So it doesn't make sense to try to imitate them early on, because again, you might be approximating and you might not even know you're doing it, because our ears are so trained to our native language that when we hear foreign sounds, they almost don't register with us until we've heard them enough times. So again, be very careful with your pronunciation early on, because you can lock in sounds and continue to use sounds even when you've heard these sounds millions of times in your input, but because you've produced them yourself, you could be fossilizing pronunciation errors. So with that, we say pronunciation is no different than anything else in comprehensible input. You develop better pronunciation simply by listening to content in the language you're learning. A surprising thing for a lot of people, and it surprised me, is just watching the mouth of the presenter as they speak the language you're trying to learn can actually influence you when you go to speak that language later, because you kind of notice, even if it's subconsciously, the subtle differences of how people's mouths move when they're speaking that target language. And you'll notice that once you've gotten a lot of input, your mouth will start to move instinctually in the ways that you've noticed that over your hundreds and hundreds of hours listening to comprehensible input. So then when do you actually start speaking? Well, speaking isn't something that you should really be trying to force yourself to do unless you need to. For most people, speaking will just spontaneously begin once you have enough input acquired. For languages close to English, assuming you're a native English speaker, like Spanish, Italian, German, you could expect yourself to be getting comfortable enough to speak around the 600 hour to 1200 hour mark. It's a broad time span, but that's when you might start noticing small phrases appearing in your head without you really consciously trying to switch languages. Or you might notice, this is what I've noticed, for instance, if you're listening to input and then someone interrupts you in English, you might almost respond in the language you're listening to by accident. And I think those small signs are good signs that your brain is becoming comfortable actually speaking the language you're learning, which really only means you have enough input for your brain to be comfortable producing sentences in the language you're learning. But that doesn't mean you should feel pressure to speak between the 600 and 1200 hour mark. As a general rule, the longer you wait to speak, the better your speech will be. But of course, most people don't have time, most learners don't have time to wait possibly a year, 2 years, 3 years before ever making their first sound in the language they're learning. So of course, if you want to speak earlier, that's totally a decision up to you, as long as you know it's not really helping your acquisition and there are some small risks attached to doing it. Even if you only wait 150 hours to start speaking, you'll already be speaking much more smoothly with less awkward intonations and weird non-native giveaways than someone who learned from a traditional classroom method which said speak right away, speak early on. I think back to a friend I have who learned Spanish in a very traditional way and now has a way of speaking which is very unnatural to somebody who learned like me in a comprehensible input way. Because in Spanish, for instance, a lot of times words connect together when they're spoken. So a good example of this is ¿qué es esto? ¿Qué es esto? Which is just like, what is this, right? But it's actually 3 words. And to someone who doesn't speak Spanish, it might only sound like 2 words. ¿Qué es esto? And if you say in Spanish, ¿qué es esto?, you sound a little bit non-native, or very, very much non-native. And that's the type of awkward speaking pattern that usually is a result of trying to speak too early before you've had enough actual authentic input in the language you're trying to learn. I don't think we should pretend that 1,000 hours is a reasonable expectation for people to wait. If you're living in the country, you're working in the country, you'll probably need to speak the language in some capacity. And I don't think that having the most perfect of perfect accents is as important as, you know, communicating with people, making friends, and just being a general human who's not crazy, because, at a certain point, people are going to be like, all right, buddy, you speak Spanish, like just speak to me in Spanish or French or German, right? There are some general tips I would suggest that if you are needing to speak, try not to consciously try to formulate sentences in your head, and instead just speak at the level you understand, where your grammar might not be perfect and you might sound like a child sometimes, but that's just where you are in your language learning process. So though I did say that good pronunciation is a result of listening to tons of authentic input, that's true, it's also true that some sounds in some languages are just objectively difficult to make, like the Spanish rolled R, guttural Mediterranean throat sounds that we don't have in English, and the Semitic languages have, and even Spain from Spanish has. And I've heard, the big groups of consonants in some of the Germanic languages, or the Slavic languages can also be hard for people. And those probably will take some focused practice for you to actually be able to nail. I still wouldn't try to drill them until you have a good amount of authentic input in the language you're trying to learn. But I don't want to suggest to you that you'll be able to make all these difficult sounds perfectly just by listening to authentic input. There is some muscular acclimation that has to take place to speak another language. So don't misunderstand me there. Also, don't misunderstand me as saying that speech coaches or people to help you practice pronunciation are just wasting your time and they're a waste of money. I don't think that's true at all. I think if you want a near native accent, then you probably will need speech coaching, and you probably will need actual, focused practice and even conscious understandings of how these sounds are made. That being said, getting to a near native accent is insanely time intensive, and it's up to each individual learner to decide whether it's worth it for their specific case. For me, I don't think it is. Estoy muy contento con el acento que tengo ahora en español. As long as people can understand me, I'm not super concerned with sounding perfect, because I am not delivering speeches at the UN in different languages. And most people just want their language for a casual day-to-day use. So speech therapy and speech teachers might be great for some people who do need them, but for the casual learner, and I say casual, kind of hard to say casual when we're talking about language learning, but for the casual side of language learners, to me, and again, it's up to you, but to me, I don't think most people need it. Just my opinion, but I'm not saying it doesn't work. Thank you for watching episode 5 of my How to Learn a Language with Comprehensible Input series. If you are learning a language using Comprehensible Input, you should track your progress. If you were running an ultra marathon and you didn't mark where you started and where you're ending, you'd have no idea where you are. And that's how long the language learning process takes when you use Comprehensible Input. It is a ultra marathon. You should track that. And then to track that and find content in the language that you're learning, you should head over to my website, Lengualytics.com, where you can find Comprehensible Input content in many different languages and also track it. And you get nice social media features and little rewards and gamification and all the things that are going to help you stay motivated as you learn your target language. Thanks for watching.